You've got it. You better stop it. Ooh. You've got it. You've got it.
This episode of the Ready State Podcast is brought to you by Cock Punch Coffee.
Just so you know, I just got back from Italy.
True fact.
They have such a culture of good coffee there.
It's so good.
And you stand at an espresso bar, right? You actually stand there. And what I was thinking to myself is, this coffee isn't better than the coffee I have at home.
No.
You know why?
I mean,
Cock Punch.
yeah, and this coffee is so high quality and it has the lowest carbon footprint available,
Yeah,
which
the
is
bellwether
cool.
machine is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, but I mean, this coffee just tastes so good. It has so many flavorful notes that it's the coffee that we're always running in our espresso machine these days.
Can we talk about the fact that even our youngest daughter, 15.
Yeah, and we've unfortunately developed her into being a coffee snob, which I don't recommend as a parent, but we're already there. So
she's like, I really appreciate the notes of this Cock Punch coffee. And I'm like, hold up, just go back
Wait,
in time.
aren't you 15?
One of the cool things about Tim Ferriss's coffee is that it's all the profits go to his nonprofit, SciSay.
Yeah, and the SciSay Foundation is focused on cutting-edge scientific research that explores treating conditions that are widely considered untreatable, which I think is super cool. Coffee with a cause.
Coffee with a cause. But honestly, that's the wrong reason to drink it. Change the world, whatever, low carbon footprint. The reason is that it makes a great cup of coffee. But don't believe me. See it
Go
for yourself.
try it for yourself.
I think we say check and verify, trust and verify.
Yes.
Go verify it with yourself. And you can do that by going to cockpunchcoffee.com/TRS and use the code TRS for 20% off your first purchase.
This episode of the Ready State Podcast is brought to you by Gibboard. And look, there's not a lot of fitnessy devices that we're going to put right square in the middle of our cool mid-century modern house. But the Gibboard is one of them.
Yeah. Imagine a really big skate deck, kind of curled up, looks like a big shallow U.
Yeah.
And there's a slack line going across the middle.
Yeah, but it just looks cool and looks fun. And, we have this thing
It's
in our
not
house.
about that. It's about functionality, about improving your balance and having strong
But
feet.
also, we've talked about how important it is to incorporate play into our everyday lives and how, especially as adults, we forget to do that. And, in addition to being great, like functional fitness, balance training, help us get older kind of training, this thing is basically the way you enter our house is to come in through our garage door and it's right there.
Next to the kitchen.
Next to the kitchen. And basically everybody who comes in our house is drawn to it and immediately is like, what is this? And they immediately just start getting on it and playing around with it.
Yeah, it's pretty intuitive. I can't say enough that if you come and work with me, we're going to talk about your feet.
Yeah. And balance.
And balance. We hand out so many of these. I'm like, hey, you got to get one of these. And really, I think we sometimes come at balance from the perspective of like, oh, you've fallen, or, hey, we need to improve your foot so that your back doesn't hurt. When really, this is a performance hack. You will ski better, you'll bike better, you'll run better.
You'll age better. And
that's important to you.
this thing is super lightweight, like you could move it around, but it also will support even larger folks like you.
Whoa. Yeah, it really does. Because I remember when I first saw it, I was like, that's cute, kid's toy. Because we had actually a really early slack line for our kids.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is not going to work for me.
No, and it didn't.
We have a slack line in the backyard. You may not have ability to put a slack line, a Gibbard slack line, a Gibbon slack line in your backyard, but the Gib board is the Gibbon slack line on a board. Get one today. It will change your life.
Go to gibboardus.com/TRS and use code TRS for $10 off any Gibboard. On this episode of the Ready State Podcast, we're delighted to welcome David Vaux. David, a former London firefighter turned osteopath and academic, draws on his extensive experience to advocate for strength training, particularly for older adults. With degrees in osteopathy and health and exercise science, he's a leading voice in promoting resilience and healthy aging. He also leads therapy and exercise for a major UK arthritis charity and has contributed to public health initiatives. His book, Stronger, published by Hachette in 2024, aims to make strength training accessible for all for better long-term health.
Look, I think we can't hear the message enough. We've got to get stronger. And more importantly, for a lot of us who are doing that, we need to bring everyone else along.
Yeah.
I think what David has done beautifully here is he's given people a template to begin strength training, regressions and progressions, not just kind of low level like physical therapy exercise, but like how do you regress and progress basic movements like the push-up?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've really all come to realize that, muscle mass and strength are like a 401k for aging.
Oh, are you saying I'm rich?
Yeah, you are rich because
Thanks,
you are
baby.
you are quite muscular. But what I love about this book is he not only makes the case for why strength training is critical for us as we age, but he makes it a very practical book. It's sort of a how-to.
Yeah.
Like if you're someone who's never strength trained, you don't relate to it, you don't understand. This book Stronger really sort of gives people like, he just sort of opens a door for people being able to start to figure out how to incorporate strength training into their life.
I love that he comes from being a firefighter and being injured and changing careers, right? And then also sort of always being an academic and then working on the sort of public health initiative piece. He really sees the full spectrum of this. And one of the things I think he does really well is highlights not just like some nebulous concept, but of strength is better, but you have to be explosive if you want your brain to work. If you want your brain to function really well, you've got to move and practice moving in sort of dynamic ways.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of, actionable information and takeaways in this episode.
He's
So
great.
I hope you enjoy our conversation with David Vaux. David, welcome to the Ready State podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So first of all, I just want to say congratulations on your book, which we have a copy of it sitting right here. And actually just had a chance to finally finish reading it. Again, we got an early version of it, and then this is sort of the real thing in hardcover, and just finished reading it again over the weekend. And congratulations. There's so much useful, actionable information in there.
Well, I appreciate that. That's lovely to hear. I'm glad you had an early copy. Yeah, it's been a journey. It's ongoing. I think, as you know, once you write something, it takes on a life of its own, isn't it? So I'm glad that you felt that it was worth a read. That's for sure. I've certainly enjoyed yours.
Well, I'll tell you what, set this up for us. Tell us where you're coming from and sort of what your day job looks like, because there's some aspects of this book that I think are really nuanced and subversive in terms of behavior hacking, sort of stacking, looking at habits. Because I think if we poll our neighbors and say, should you strength train? Everyone's like, yep, we should totally strength train. They're like, how do you strength train? And what
They're
weights
not
do you use?
doing
And
it.
they're not doing it. And how do you begin if you've never done that? And there's a lot to, that you've really taken a beautiful, elegant swing at. But tell us how you got to here.
I got there. I think, like a lot of people, I'm middle-aged myself, and it was kind of a hard lesson, still trying to keep up with a 21-year-old sort of mindset or people I was training with. And I felt that my physiology was training and actually detraining as opposed to improving because of that kind of that exposure to high intensity, lack of recovery. So that was going on in the background into the last. I'm 52, and so into the last 5 years or so. And then I started. So I'm a clinician. So I'm an osteopath. I work in private practice with people. I have a special interest in healthy aging, and I work also. I'm a head of therapies for a UK-based arthritis charity. I'm head of therapies and exercise. So I kind of did that role because I was trying to reach more people than I could individually in a one-on-one setting. I then started working on UK government healthy aging challenge projects, which is basically trying to improve people's health span. And in working on those, really, in the last couple of years, during lockdown specifically, I sort of thought, this is me we're talking about. This is people who are going to be 70, in their 70s, in the 2030s, and just thinking, well, this is directly speaking to me. And I know from clinical work, I know from the work I've done in the past where I've been working on projects that feed into resources for people in sheltered housing and for people who are already in retirement settings, that you can do a lot of good. You can do a hell of a lot of good. But you're kind of, what I was seeing was that we're limited by the time we have left when we start. And so make a start in midlife, give yourself permission to train smart in midlife. And so I kind of wrote this, in effect, this was the book that I wish my parents had seen in midlife, because they're now in their 80s. They're doing well. But, I think they, it's that what if. And so I wrote the book that I would have wanted to read, or been glad to have seen in my midlife, I guess. So that's where it started.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that was part of our motivation in writing Built to Move
Yeah,
as well, right? I think there's a lot of sort of similar ethoses, if that's a word, in your book and our book. I would love, though, I know that you began your career as a firefighter and then had a career ending
oh yeah,
injury, which
yeah,
is, I think, what sort of started your career and interest in sort of the body and training and having a unique relationship with pain. So if you could tell that story a little bit, I'd love to hear more.
sure, yeah. Second generation London firefighter. My father did his full 30 years and retired. I was 15 years in. I was working operationally in fire rescue operations. I also did secondment as a physical education officer, which is I've always been interested in human performance. I guess what's now called tactical fitness. So tactical performance. Back then, it was just fit for firefighting duty. Um, and so I was already kind of reading around the subject. I was already very interested in human performance, purely from perspective: how can I be optimal? How can I and my team be absolutely on point if you need us? Because our lives depend on it, civilians' lives depend on it. Bit of a cliche, but that's where we were. I was stationed on a very good fire station with very good officers in charge who just gave us free rein to design our own functional fitness training. There's nothing better than being paid to work out, right? So I was already kind of in that mindset. So I did 15 years. As I said, I'd already done some educational pieces around physiology, exercise physiology, and then I suffered a series of um, it was a cumulative but series of lifting incidents where you just can't do anything but lift in an awkward position, just kind of the sketchy scenarios you find yourself in. It's just, you find yourself sometimes,
You're saying when you're fighting a fire in a serious
yeah,
situation, you
you
can't
can't
like
always do it perfectly.
perfectly brace and take.
I mean, there are some sketchy situations that kind of led to disc irritation. I know now what was going on. And then I suffered a couple of quite bad falls as well, again during operational duties. So falls and compression injuries, and it led to multiple disc prolapses, multiple nerve root impingements, all happening at the same time. And at the time, that stopped more or less stopped that operational part of my career overnight. So I went on duty that morning and came out, and I was physically changed forever. Um, and then I went on an odyssey, I guess you could say, of trying to. I mean, the fire service were understanding, but in the end, um, there wasn't a role for me in an operational setting. I didn't want to do anything when I was non-operational, so I then went down that route of trying to find answers, trying to find ways off of medication. Because at that time I was on gabapentin or a morph, you name it, I was on everything. Just trying to kind of get back to some sort of physical being again, because I had defined my life up until that point, I realized, by physical excellence and by being as good as I possibly could be in that role. So I had to reinvent that. It was a hard and fast lesson that potentially one should not just define themselves in one aspect of one's life. But I threw myself into academia, surrounded myself with people on my osteopathic training course that were real experts in movement, which was I was later to find was one of the keys. And what I found was that by, long story short, I'm giving you the potted version here, but by learning to move again without triggering the pain that had defined those years and years of post-injury experience, I slowly was able to rechange that, re-educate my nervous system, my relationship with the way I moved. I started then, once that was a bit more under control, to come off medication. I started then, this is all while I was a student, by the way. And I started then to then regain some strength. And within that, the quality of my movement started to improve. Um, and so I then subsequently qualified. And I've been wearing all those hats since then. So I wear the hat of, I sit both sides of the desk sometimes with people. I explain to them I have a daily relationship with pain. And that the one thing that I'm absolutely passionate about is that if you can move, if you can find a novel way of moving, which is where the real clinical challenge comes in, which I find fascinating. If you can find ways of prescribing movement that doesn't elicit that trigger, that hair trigger, sometimes people have, then you've got to weigh in. And then it takes time, but you've got to weigh into then reconditioning that individual. So that's my backstory, I guess. If you ask me how I identified, people, there's this thing, and this, I don't know if you have that over here, the pronouns you put. There isn't a box that says firefighter. I still identify as a firefighter. I always will. And this is, it's a bit of a cliche, but I said as much in the book that I've been looking for a new mission. I've been looking for another way of actually finding something that gets me out of bed. So that's partly what led to the book as well, I think.
So before we get into the physical piece, which I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about, but I do want to talk a little more, have you talk a little more about this identity piece. We've had a lot of guests on our podcast who have found themselves at these big transitions and crossroads in their lives. Often it's athletes whose career has ended, they've retired. We've had entrepreneurs who've sold businesses. In your case, you had a career-ending injury, and these really kind of critical life moments when you're forced to change your identity and sort of face that your identity is no longer going to be this thing, or it might become multiple things. Tell us a little bit about what that was like for you, and how was it that you then decided to move into osteopathic school? Tell us a little bit more about what that transition was like.
I guess I already was doing some reading. I already had a real interest in physical conditioning. During my firefighting career, I'd done an MSc in health and exercise science, because it helped me bring that knowledge through to tactical fitness. I was working in a role some of that time as well, trying to up the fitness standards and entry levels for recruits into fire school as well. So there was that part of me that was curious, and I guess it thankfully actually had an introduction to academic kind of grounding, that critical thinking piece. So it wasn't quite so shocking, I guess, a thought to say, right, I'm going to go to university. I'm going to go back to university now. But I was always a student, I was in my 30s, had 2 young children. And the thing that got me interested in osteopathy, frankly, was because I had some treatment that really helped me. It helped me. The osteopath I saw, a guy called Frank Kelleher, who practices in Ireland now, he was a really good friend, became a really good friend. He just changed the way I thought about the way we should move. I was very kind of hard charging. It's all about performance. It's all about not so much about rest, and it's not so much about recovery. All the things we know now, right? But you're talking about someone who was kind of quite adrenaline fueled, defining themselves by physical performance. Although I was starting to realize, I think that there was more to it than that. But then that hard stop when something physical happened, there was no longer to do that role. And I think because of those influential people, and I think that's often the way in life, that there's a few people, crossroad moments where you meet some people who kind of get you curious about other paths. Frank Kelleher in that regard was one of those people who suggested that as a career change. And frankly, I had to do something because I was a young man with a young family. So I had to kind of think, right, what next? I didn't have the luxury of spending too long deciding what to do.
Sort of wallowing around and, the existential idea of what's
I
next.
didn't have the luxury.
Right.
No, I just had to kind of plow forward. Yeah.
One of the things I want to double click on is that your perspective is one of performance. And I think Juliet and I can relate to being athletes in the 90s, where we threw a lot of eggs at the walls, early 2000s. And we saw a lot of broken people who just were like, hey, we'll get a little further next time. Just heal up, go harder, more volume. Nutrition is sort of a nebulous idea. Sleep certainly isn't even part of the conversation, which just whoever can go the hardest wins always. I have a similar backstory. I'm a professional paddler, and I end up with a cervical plexus traction injury and, overuse injury. My hand goes weak and numb. I can't turn my head, ends my paddling career. One of my friends, our friend Steffi Cohen, who is world champion powerlifter, same thing. She was having just chronic, gnarly low back pain. They said she'd never lift again. She's in physio school. And what I think is interesting is that I see the outputs that you've done here. And I love that you're working at a population level. I think Steffi's doing the same thing. We're doing the same thing, but through the lens of performance. And what I think is interesting and I love about this book is that you're always taking this view of, it's not a medicalized, hey, we're gonna put you in this little box and we'll just keep your movements tiny and we won't have any exposure and we won't respect how your brain will evolve or how your community is. And you really are saying that, hey, if we can find exposure, if we can get you moving again, that doesn't, trigger that, your sensitivity. I think what's important about this book is that you are coming, for a lot of people have had some negative experience in their body. And instead of hypermedicalizing them, you've gone ahead and said, hey, I'm going to give you permission. And here's a great entree to start to rebuild that castle. Because we just talked to a lot of people who are like, yeah, I hurt my knee back in Vietnam. I'm like, dude, you're 50. You've got 40 more years. That was 20 years ago that someone told you that. You know what I mean? Like, you've been carrying that story around. So, would you talk about a little bit of sort of the where you think or how you made some of these selections? But I just wanted to highlight everyone, the theme that I picked up very much was that, it was performance historically. That was where you came from, became a clinician, still working in population health, but you've settled back on, hey, if you do these things, actually, this is how you would become a firefighter if you wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything I think that one writes has to have integrity, I think, if you're going to then speak about it. And I can see that shines through from your books as well. And I think the part of this is that this is written for middle age. So frankly, everyone in middle age has got something going on. It'd be that an injury.
And will you define middle age? Because that's like 35.
35, 65, if you want to put a
72.
number on, but it's no longer young, right? Beyond not yet old, whatever that means. But biologically, that can mean many things as well. I mean, that's one of the pieces in this book, in that there's more and more people moving towards the fact that strength training is not just about that muscle mass repository of amino acids that give us that future-proofing, almost like future-proof body suit, but there's that piece, that neural piece as well, that is yet to be fully honed in on. But we think there's a causal pathway to longevity independently, which is fascinating. We can come back to that. But to your point of what's in there, if someone does do, I put the movements in the book. So the part one was the rationale, the why, and then part two, which is shorter, as you saw, is the how. And the how's got to work. I have to say, interestingly, I found the part one, 75% of the words really, it was really enjoyable, because it's fun to write about these things, but actually then suddenly the responsibility of thinking, oh my goodness, I've actually got to do something that can stand up here. But it does. And I think if it speaks to the fact that when you are having to talk about general population behavioral change, it's not good enough just to say, here is the advice, 150 minutes a week, moderate, or 75 minutes vigorous, and 2 sessions of strength training, and everyone gets that message and does it. It's just, we know they don't do it. The numbers are so shocking in this country. I just imagine they are there as well. I mean, 4% women, 7% guys are doing the strength training component. And so again, it's not good enough just to say, this is what you need to be doing. It's behavior change for me. When it works one-on-one, is I have a conversation with someone and I tell them a few stories. I try to get them to buy in and visualize either themselves or a family member. It's about conversation, and that's the style I wrote it in. I was trying to write it as the person next door having a chat over the fence, really. But yeah, within that, it's based upon, I've spoken to, I was given some time from some very generous people. It's not just my opinion, these are people who, world leading, who have all molded and given their opinion. And so in terms of performance, it's true. I do look at it, and I think if people put it like this, I was speaking to a journalist a few weeks ago, and she was about my age, and she's been a lifelong fitness enthusiast. And I was saying, were asking questions. And she said, "Oh, my husband knew I was speaking to you and asked me this question to ask you." I said, "Sure, what is it?" He said, "Well, I've never done anything. Had a knee injury from school." I thought, okay, so what? So that's 25 years ago. I said, "Yeah, okay, what is it?" He said, "Well, can I start?" I said, "Well, yeah, there's always something you can do. If there's a movement you can't do, find an alternative. This is like a couch to 5K for strength. It's not meant to get you to the finished product. It's meant to be opening a door into the world of strength and conditioning." But I said something that she was shocked by. I said, if I, as in me, and the journalist was to stop now, and your husband was to now start, then your husband wins every time, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, if I've been fit and I know what I'm talking about, and I have this kind of portfolio of medals and experience and stuff that I've done all these athletic things. It doesn't matter. He wins the gold medal for aging if he starts and we stop now. And I think that's where I was coming from. That performance, especially when I work with some of the people I love working with, which is in clinic, mostly the older clientele. I love working with older people than me because of the wisdom and experience, and it's hopefully fed into the way I practice now as well. In that, for me, it's the long game now. I'm focused now. I've given myself permission not to try and keep up with a 21-year-old, and have a headache for a week because I've trained too hard. That kind of, we've all been there, right? Literally, I'd be laying in a darkened room with a headache, having pushed myself to that extreme.
Overdone it.
So it's about that permission. It's about that piece of permission that middle-aged people can, consistently turn up.
We actually have a phrase for that phenomenon. And we say, "I made you some toast, but I burned down the house." And
Love it. Yeah.
it's like, this is the best toast I ever had. And you're like, I smoked that 21-year-old. By the way, I'll be taking this week off.
2 weeks sometimes for me.
This episode of the Ready State podcast is brought to you by Momentous. And today, what we want to talk about is how awesome creatine is.
Yeah, safe.
Effective.
Of all the things, like if you're covering your nutrition, getting enough protein, getting enough fruits and vegetables, drinking some water, then someone asked me this weekend at a course, what supplement should I take? And I was like, oh, no brainer, creatine. I don't even think it's a supplement. I'm like, this is like a food, and it's so easy to use. It's so safe to use. Literally, you should be adding it. No brainer.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for many of us who are no longer 20 and focused on getting strong and building muscle as we age, this is
I'm trying to squeeze out one more rep, bro.
Yeah, this is like creatine is a perfect companion to that goal and kind of a must have.
For brain health, heart health, muscle health, bone health.
Yeah,
it's
and
insane.
Anyone who wants to learn more, we had a great episode with one of the world's foremost experts on creatine, Dr. Darren Kandow, on our podcast in 2023. Worthy of going back to listen to that if you're sort of creatine curious. But yeah, Momentous creatine is like part of the Starrett everyday routine, including our teenage daughters.
Yeah, and those of you who are listening, you have teenagers who are pushing on it. So safe. Get your kids on some creatine. Take some creatine yourself. There's very few use cases where I can't think it is about improving your durability, longevity, and so safe.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to kids and teens, but all youth athletes, one of the things we love about Momentous is that everything is NSF certified. Yeah. So you know that what you're taking is what it says it is in the bag, and you know that it's safe to take if you're an athlete, even a serious competitive athlete.
That's right. So you get on some creatine today and do that by going to livemomentous.com/TRS and use code TRS for a whopping 20% off your first purchase.
This episode of the Ready State podcast is brought to you by Element. Is it too soon to continue talking about sparkling Element?
Oh my gosh. A couple things here. One is we need to remind people that when it comes to performance, nutrition, hydration, we try to separate those things out. Unless you're doing a sport where you cannot physically eat something, then you drink your calories. But otherwise, we're like, don't drink your calories, eat food.
Yeah, actual food.
And then hydrate. And from a performance perspective, all of the best athletes in the world we work with, I mean, all of them are on Element. We give Element away, then they're like, holy crap, this solves such big problems for us.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we don't talk about often enough is just how good Element tastes, and especially on a hot day. You know, it's
Yeah, we just
starting.
had our first heat wave.
Yeah, it's like, you know, we had a big heat wave. We love to ride our mountain bikes, and I think oftentimes the last thing we all want to put into our mouths is like something that's like overly sweet, like a lot of sports drinks and other electrolyte drinks. But man, Element is just so tasty and so good, especially on a hot day, and is like our number one go-to when we're on bike rides, especially on hot days.
Yeah, you know, I was just talking with a really good university team. They are using Element heavily right now because big kids in the heat, right? It's like summer ball. We have to start thinking about replacing electrolytes more effectively. I just saw something that one of the best endurance runners on the planet is eating a gram of salt an hour. And that's just during his runs. So if that's part of the plan, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not, I guarantee you, you're losing more salt. And because you're eating foods probably in your life, you're not getting enough salt. Or I mean, if you could just drink 1 can of Campbell's soup, or probably not, go ahead and have an Element.
And as an added bonus, you can add some sparkling Element to that mix, and it's this dope-ass 16-ounce can.
Yeah.
It's our go-to sparkly beverage these days, especially when we're jumping in and out of the sauna
Crushing
and
it.
sweating our
Crushing it.
tails off.
Get
So
on the Element tip.
get on the
people.
Element,
It'll change
people.
your life. Right now, if you want to order a drink mix through our link, you get a free sample pack with all of Element's flavors. Mine currently, of course, is grapefruit. And if you want a party in your mouth, try sparkling Element. It's in a 16-ounce can. Go to drinkelement.com/TRS. Try it today.
I think this is actually a direct quote from the book, but it is: strength training is the single most important factor in older age health.
Yep.
Can you talk about why that is?
Well,
Where do you start?
I realize that's
right?
your entire book, but you know, start somewhere. Why is it
and
so
maybe
important?
start at the pointy end of the stick. Like, give us some examples, because I want to just remind everyone, you're working at the population health with the UK National Health System. You're working with the Arthritis Foundation, and you're a clinician. So, you know, you have these hats where sometimes people are like, well, you have this little tiny perspective of you're a clinician working one-on-one with people. You can't see the whole population. Yet you here are, you know, coming from high performance, then have this one-on-one experience where you can really deep dive. And then you're also working at these population levels. So you can see some of the bigger meta trends that you can't sometimes when you're putting out fires for people in their individual lives.
yeah, I love that analogy. I guess it comes from having access to that information. Yeah, you're right. So for me, I look at frailty and I look at the longevity sector, and I think that, you know, we, as certainly in the UK, we spend more time on the toilet than we do exercising, which is shocking stat, but that's true.
Whoa, that's good.
So,
Probably extended by the fact that everyone is on their phone on the toilet now, so they're spending even more time on the toilet.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is we move less, we live longer. That paradox, and part of that is that we're no longer putting ourselves in uncomfortable or inconvenient positions. Okay, because life is so much easier. We're moving straight lines in boxes on wheels or rail and planes and stuff, and you know, we don't very often deliberately inconvenience ourselves physically anymore. And you know, we stop challenging ourselves physically generally when we leave school or college. And therein lies a problem for me, is that in midlife, you get a lot, and you probably see this a lot. I bet, I mean, no doubt you see this a lot, where you get people coming to you and they've done a lot of like Ironman type stuff, which is fabulous. Don't get me wrong, I've got a lot of respect for that, but that's part of it. The missing part is the fast twitch part. If we were to make sure there are programs in place that we can strength train to specifically target fast twitch, production of power, that in itself will prevent the vast majority of things we wrongly characterize with aging. Things like stiffness, joint pain, weakness, slowing speed, literally older parents and relatives who shrink and slow overnight. It's because of that sarcopenic hormonal drop that we have in midlife, which falls off a cliff when we get into our 60s. And the reason people are shocked by it, well, it can't be me because I run, I play tennis. All these things are fabulous again, but it's part of it. The missing part is that fast twitch bit, because our fast twitch fibers will not be preserved by endurance type activity to the same extent that they will be just really efficiently by controlled strength training, a controlled, challenging environment of strength training. So that's the one part, is that fast twitch, speed of contraction, maintenance of larger fibers, that age-proof suit to take you through aging with you. One of the commentators I worked with, a guy called Professor Samir Gray, is on record as saying that the majority of aging characteristics I've just described are actually the loss of physical condition. And I fully agree that if this message is taken on earlier than, 70 or 80, then the vast majority of things can be prevented. It's like the classic thing, have a fire, then put a fire alarm in, right? The preventative piece is the important piece. And so if you have the fast twitch, you're less likely to trip and fall. Biggest killer from injury over 65 globally, falling. You're more likely to reposition your foot. I know you guys are no doubt familiar with this, but you'd be amazed at people who aren't. Not only is that fast twitch allowing you to readjust to save yourself from a fall, you are also, I believe, sending a message to your deep cellular self, your deep, your brain, your sensory homunculus, which is hardwired to understand what's going on in your world. And if you're sending signals that you're doing challenging, controlled things, including grip, including leg strength, all these things that seem to have an independent causative aging benefit, then you're setting yourself up not to age as quickly as you might have otherwise aged, frankly. Then there's a part of muscle mass, which is, the literal amino acid repository that our bodies carry around for us. So cellular homeostasis, our housekeeping, hormonal development, all these things. And actually, a lot of people, including myself, now believe that the skeletal muscle mass, the musculoskeletal system, should be viewed as an immune organ in its own right, which is why, if that isn't on point, or if you've let that fall off a cliff via the wrong exercise choices, or maybe unwise exercise choices, or too specialized exercise choices, then it's not going to be there for you in the same way as if you had that full spectrum. So there's also the very real threat, without that age-proof suit of fast twitch fiber, of sarcopenia, of osteoporosis as well. And again, when we think about strength, because we talked about muscle there, but then I'm going to talk about strength, because we can reacquire strength in older age without reacquiring muscle mass. There is that kind of slightly mysterious relationship between what is strength and what is, and muscle mass doesn't always equate. So that neurological piece in firing of the muscle itself is really fascinating. And frankly, with that strength intact, that balance piece as well, with that comes our ability to move and make the choices, to say yes to things in older age, to go hiking, rowing, kayaking. It's all there. It means we have the choice to move, because frankly, I've worked with people, people are often shocked, but often their lives are defined by the four walls within the house within which they live now, because they can't get out of the chair.
That's right. Yeah. And their brains are discouraging.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. And the path. Yeah. Because it's a VO2 max to get out of the chair at that point for them. Right. Right. It's a VO2 max. It's the equivalent of them squatting 700 pounds to get out of that chair for them. Right then. And, they're, just by simply adopting a few simple life hacks, not even the 12-week program I lay out, but even just a few life hacks, strength hacks, making use of fallow time, dead time in your day, might stop that happening. We just don't know exactly what, but it might stop. So if it might stop, then when the kettle's boiling, do a wall sit. I mean, it's. But to finish to your point, I think there is something going on those pillars. So you've got the fast twitch, saving yourself, neural communication with your cellular self. Then you've got the repository, and then you've got the final bit, which is the movement, which your joints need. You guys know this. Your joints are healthy. The brain will interpret movement that all is well, and there's something in that as well. So if we can move, the brain will interpret, especially pain-free movement, that all is well in life and there's nothing to worry about, and then everything will improve. So I mean, that long story, but that's my answer, I guess, to that.
So you mentioned or touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to talk about it more. And that is this obsession that it seems like your culture and our culture has with doing cardio.
Yeah,
You mentioned the Iron Man, but if you sort of, lower the standard there a little bit, most of the people we know in our community default to doing cardio as their form of exercise. So jogging,
Monostructural
monostructural, running,
Yeah.
biking, pelotoning, indoor cycling classes. I mean, that you name it, but that's sort of the default. And it seems like in the fitness, health business writ large, we did a really good job actually of telling people that that was important in like the 80s and 90s, and people got the message and they started doing it. I think also it's connected to this idea that a skinny body is an ideal body, and there's a perception that cardio.
Whoa! You just looked right at me when you said that.
Oh my God. And there's a perception that doing cardio promotes that kind of skinny body. I do think the perception here is starting to change. There is more of an interest in strength training. I know that there at least is a trend in the US in more women signing up for gyms and reporting being specifically interested in strength training. So it does seem to be trending in the right direction. I think your book, our book, Peter Attia's book, there's, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is talking a lot about strength. So there's a group of people that are trying to say, hey, cardio is great. You got to do that, but you also need to strength train. How are you? I think it's a sort of a mental hurdle for people. I don't know if it's because they don't like it. They're not used to it. They don't know what to do. It's the barrier. So how do you?
Running is very skilled, but biking can be skilled, but it's unskilled.
Yeah.
And I think people appreciate that you just get on, you suffered, you got off, and you took no skill or training in. We didn't have to learn how to breathe hard, right? I can just put on ruck and walk up a hill. And this is requiring me to actually engage and basically learn a new language.
Yeah, and I think part of it is a little bit of this deprogramming of what physical health means, deprogramming and reprogramming, and so.
I don't know.
How are you
think
doing that?
Steroids, cocaine, and blood flow restriction. We'll just put all of the mass on people we can.
It's fine.
Right?
But anyway, so how
Kelly,
are you
that's
getting
not
people there?
just to clarify. I don't write about that in that book. She touched the book. Which said that.
Yeah, I know he was like pointing at your book while he was
great.
saying that. That's
Sorry.
but anyway, how are you getting people to that place in there?
Yeah.
Because I'm this is really more of a mental thing for people. How do you get people to the place where they say, okay, yeah, I get it. I understand. I mean, part of it is reading books like your book, but in clinic or when you're working at the population level, how are you helping to sort of deprogram the cardio is king mentality?
It's that's the question. Yeah, I think anyone wrestling with this is coming up against how-to bit. For me, I know that. So it's about having conversations. It's about actually framing it as a friend. Every behavioural change starts with a conversation. And so I adopted a style in the book to try to have a conversation with a stranger, to try and bring in examples from my life, from my patients' lives, from the work I've done one-on-one and at population level. And we found at a population level that by having conversations with peers who you identify with, or by telling a story or giving a case study of someone who is identifiable as someone who's similar to them, will often help. Education, preventative education, is never sexy, and unfortunately, the rise of social media that give kind of misleading narratives of how to do it for middle-aged people as well, is something that I feel like the book is an antidote to. So I try to tell stories, I try to give examples, and I try to have a bit of humor with it, because what I'm not trying to do is complicate it. Although there's a lot of information in there, I've tried to use everyday examples and descriptive terms that I don't think have been used before, about how, using an analogy of a sail as a sail instead of a muscle, and a rope instead of a tendon. Just trying to draw people in. And I'm very aware that not everyone is going to read part one and then go through and do part two. But I'm very hopeful that people will pick up the book, and if they do read it from front to back, then there are some people who will adopt some of the practices in there. And it's meant to be a doorway into, places like CrossFit gyms, into leisure centers and gyms, or just into a slight change. One of those changes could be, one of the ones I described in the back of the book, where, it used to be, I used to get so angry with my fiance for taking longer, we were always late for things, because she takes a long time to get ready, and I can never work out why, and it would drive me mad. So, we would have an argument. I would say, come on, we're going to be late. Now I just do a wall sit. I adopt either a plank or a wall sit, and I make use of that time. And she comes downstairs, and instead of me being angry, she bursts out laughing. I say, "How long were you there for?" I said, "Yeah, it's 3.5 minutes. It's a new record." So I think just having some humor, saying that, I'm no athlete anymore. I do these practice. I do my practice, but it doesn't define me anymore. It used to define me, but now it doesn't anymore. It just should be normal. So I think it's just trying to tell stories in a way that people identify with, trying to find the midlife wins, where you can make use of your time, because it's a busy time. But I think, to the bigger question, in wrestling with this problem, because I have been wrestling with it, I realized that there's often a blank spot for people who haven't been in the services or haven't had this as a career from a very early age. I was introduced to this at 17. I was introduced to Olympic lifting. I did some courses around that. I was introduced to this culture, and it stuck with me. It's just like getting up. It's like breathing for me. So for me, I realized, I'm fluent in this, and I think other people, it takes time, and it is like building a relationship. It's like a language you have to use. You give yourself permission not to be perfect at it. It takes years. It takes years and years to become fluid in these movements. But it doesn't mean you're not gaining benefit from it. And this blank spot that I think is there for the majority of UK middle-aged people is because that from an early age, even in college and school, the importance of this isn't taught. And I think, where I'm going next probably is to look into that and say, if we really want to make a population change, we need to go back and deal with our children. I've got a teenage stepdaughter. I've got two 20-year-old sons. And, they didn't get that memo. They did from me, but it was only me that gave them that memo,
Right, just because you happen to be their dad, but not because they were learning.
They weren't
that
learning at school. They were playing,
places,
they were playing the sports, which is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. You shouldn't specialize too early, but I think you should have an educational piece around the importance of it. And, I'm horrified by the rise of how social media is hijacked for this younger cohorts into performance enhancing drugs are being normalized. Body dysmorphia in males and females is being normalized. This whole thing that you mentioned about a woman feeling they should shrink down and be skinny and not necessarily healthy and strong has been normalized. And I think the way to try to counter that is to try and do something around people who are younger. So, because otherwise it's hard trying to change in midlife, anything in midlife. I mean, most guys don't grow up until they're about 45 anyway. But trying to change then at that point is hard
You
ask.
looked right at me.
Keeps getting lower.
No, I was looking at myself,
we had a
Kelly.
recent guest
Kelly, I
who
was
was
looking at
like,
myself, mate.
I think it was Mike Brown who came on, and he was like, most guys don't grow up until they're 40, so you're at 45.
Yeah, it took me a while.
One of the things that I want to circle just back on, it's what you just said is so true and so rich. But, you talk about power development.
Yes.
And, one of my favorite coaches is a gentleman named Frans Bosch. He's a Dutch Wunder coach. And one of the things he says is that real strength training is just coordination training with resistance. And what I love about the message here is, number one, is that you're saying, hey, we actually have to look at high power and wattage. And that's true on so many levels. For us, and when we look at sort of the scope of movements, we say, well, this may hold true at low speed, but it only really is truth if it can do it at high speed. And that we know that the nervous system needs that. We have to prime that. I mean, this is why jumping and bounding is part of our book. I mean, just getting people bouncing onto their toes, to their heels, holding onto a sink is a form of jump. And there's a reason that there's that old saying that when you stop jumping, you start dying, because that jump is that coordination. It is that power. We regularly go into places and I'm like, all right, let's do peak wattage on a bike. and people die.
Yeah.
They can get into that 70% and hang on for hours and hours, but we ask them to actually push that peak wattage a little bit, push that power a little bit. And there are ways, everyone, where you can start to add that power piece, but we start to really do see changes in sort of that neurologic efficiency. And I really love that. I think my pushback on a lot of what I've been seeing is just that muscle solves all problems. I'm like, all right, we just need another cylinder on the car. Right now in Formula One, our daughter's obsessed. We have a new dog named after a Formula One driver. And these little Formula One cars are 1.8 liter, 4-cylinder engines with batteries. They're milking out so many horsepower out of this little tiny block. Instead of like, hey, everyone needs a V12. Yeah. If we just get everyone muscle mass, yes, we'll have some benefits. But in here, there's a lot of coordination. There's a lot of skill work.
Yeah, balance.
Yeah, and to wrap it all together, which I think is so important, is that you also said fun. Julian and I put play as one of our chief goals. And I think we have taken strength and conditioning and we've made it so clinical. Yes. And we've made it so unfun. It's really fun to go ride a bike with your mates. It's really unfun to like do heavy front squats with your kids. Like no one wants to do that. I think you really hit on something here in terms of that fun piece. How do you suggest that we get and create fun out of this?
That's a great question, Kelly. I think I think people just take themselves too seriously, take life too seriously, take strength training too seriously.
Do I have to go somewhere to strength train? Do I have to leave my house?
Do you have to leave it? Of course not. No, you can. Well, certainly power. You can develop power doing most things. As you know, just a bounce is. The interesting thing about training for power is that you don't actually have to perform a more powerful move to develop power. It's the intention. It's your intention to develop powerful movements that will cause a cascade of events to your nervous system that can improve that firing sequence, which I find fascinating. You don't actually have to physically be measured and shown to be successful in creating more power. But if you intend to, when you come back the next time, you probably would have adapted. I think science, which is what we're talking about, can be fun, I think, but only if it's described in stories and in real-time kind of events and real-time, people and experiences that have gone through this. I think, as I say, I think the subject's been somewhat hijacked by people who want to make money out of making it either serious or complicated. And there's a machismo behind strength, which is rubbish. Strength, being the strongest, that potentially being, there's a masculinity thing around it, which I think is toxic as well sometimes, which is another debate, I'm sure. But you can strength train anytime, anywhere. It depends, because, as a breakdown, you can just do an isometric or a plyometric. It all feeds into the same efficiency building that you're doing. I don't go to the gym anymore. I've got everything I need at home. I don't really buy into,
and that is the revolution, isn't it? We love
that. It's kind of, we know what we're doing, right? Yeah, it's like, but I mean, occasionally I dip my toe in the water and I last about half an hour because it's kind of so different to the 80s. Probably a good thing. But I and also generally they'd ask me to do a gym induction, which I kind of really can't really understand. But so I do my own thing now. I'm grumpy middle-aged guy, but it should be fun. If I do go somewhere, if I have a weight training belt on, I've got a smiley face on the back of it, or something positive, just to sort of make it less serious and intense for all these younger guys.
So I've got a question for you. Over here at the Ready State, we kind of have this philosophy that like all movement is good movement. And sometimes I will say for me, that philosophy gets a bit challenged on the internet when I see that people are embracing the idea of doing strength training. You can see that they've kind of gotten the initial message of this book, which is you should strength train. And they're now trying to figure out the how to do it and how much to do it. Sometimes I see things on the internet that I'm like, wow, okay, if that's strength training, we still have a long way to go. And
or I guess you're very detrained.
Yeah, very detrained.
Okay.
And so I guess in your mind, is any strength training good? And I'm assuming the answer is yes, because something's better than nothing. And also, is there sort of like a good, better, best, right? Like, because one of the things I worry about, and let me give you an example, is that, your Peloton comes with like two 2-pound weights. And then you can do your Peloton programming that has a strength training piece where you're doing a bunch of moves with 2-pound weights. And maybe that's good. Is that best? Is that count as strength training? I really try to take myself out of my bias because, like you, I've been training since I was, 14 years old. So I don't know. What's your take on that? How do we approach that? Making sure that this message of strength training doesn't get reduced to, doing 10 reps of 2-pound weights over our head and thinking we've checked the box of strength training.
Yeah. I mean, I'd never want to stop anyone from doing that, because if that's all they do, then good for them. That's something. And who knows? My goal is the next 30 years. I want to finish this strong. And everyone's journey is slightly different. But so who's to say that person who does the Peloton 2-pound weights won't finish strong? But who's to say they will? So I think I would say anything is better than nothing. The kind of strength hack stuff is that if that's your jam, then do that. In an ideal world, I'd want people to be a little bit more curious and to kind of put more of a program in. And I've given some broad outlines for that. But it's very much got to suit their lives, because, nothing's going to, I'm ideally hoping that people will be looking to do things in the long term, not the, not just for the short term. So I actually believe that a bit of challenge control, that 7 out of 10 I talk about, where, you've got 3 reps in reserve. So you're pushing yourself quite hard, but it's not too easy. If we're talking about real strength, then we know that this is optimal. What I try to promote is functional hypertrophy, which is why I talk about reps of 10 as opposed to reps of 5, which is pure strength. Because when you're starting someone out, my take on it is, well, let's build them up. Let's get the movements in. Let's build a bit of hypertrophy. They're going to get newbie gains anyway. So let's focus on that. And then let's suggest a mixture of the two. So you're getting that hypertrophy piece, that age-resistant suit, but you're not going crazy and isolating muscles. You're doing functional movements only that are going to be fun, ideally the ones you meet in life. And then you're going to do the strength part, which is that more neural component, which is the fascinating part for me, and the power as well. So that really are talking about those fast twitch fibers firing, and you really are talking about those patterns of movement firing and learning those movements. Just like any other skill, takes time. So I'm hoping that what people do is become curious. It isn't a textbook. It isn't too heavy with references, but it does have a next steps. And I think for a book, I've been considering other assets to go with it, and I've been considering that, whether that is digital assets or whether it's kind of something, more like a documentary, or maybe that's a combination of all of it. But I don't think anyone's got the answer yet. I think we're honing in on the answer of behavioral change and how to get more people stronger over time. And this is my first my first exploration into behavioral change on this level. But I don't have all the answers, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and I just shout out to you, right? I mean, I think you make the very strong case that strength, being strong is important, that it's important to start in midlife, and that you actually have a program. You have a door, like you said, a doorway in, a place where people who are curious about strength training have gotten the message that it's important, but really have no idea where to start. And I think that's what's so awesome and revolutionary about this book, is it is ultimately very accessible. And gives people this entree in. It gives people a place to begin. So whoever is listening to this, if you're like, okay, I've gotten the message from multiple sources, I need to start strength training, but how? This book is the place to go, because it really does, give some simple, accessible programming and a way to begin.
And I want to just highlight something for everyone who's listening, is that I can tell your background in performance, because the exercises you suggest have examples of regression and progression. They aren't physio-related exercises, or like where we're managing a low-level sort of babysit exercise that doesn't do something. These are, if you did these things, even starting from level 1, you would eventually find yourself in an Olympic lifting situation, swinging, snatching kettlebells. You would have the foundations. And I want to just highlight and just love on you for a second, just saying that when I go in there, because I looked at the book the first time months ago, and I was like, oh boy, here we go. Which exercise is going to offend me?
Yeah.
And what I love was, I was like, oh look, we're regressing and progressing, which is exactly what we need to do, and teach people sort of the root languages of foundational exercise training. And then from there, you can kind of spin off and go crazy. But I just love that you've regressed and progressed instead of saying, here's a set of exercises that you'll never use again.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was the goal. That means a lot coming from you guys. I see it as like, because we are going to progress and regress, but as long as we're stronger than we would have been had we done nothing, then, I see strength as like you're climbing up a rope, and you get to kind of, in 20s, and you start coming down that rope. And the people who continue come down that rope more slowly. So they're still off the ground. They haven't hit the ground yet. And I think, we're going to progress and regress all our lives, aren't we? I think. And it's just having that in plain sight.
Well, David, congratulations again on this awesome book, and thanks for letting us be a part of it in a small way.
Where would we find you?
And where do people find you, learn more, pick up a copy?
Yeah, so the book's launching the second week of July in the US and Canada. So I'm sure we can create some links to that. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can find me on Instagram. That's really the only social media I do. I'm getting better at it. It's all part of the journey, isn't it? I'm sure I can learn a lot from your respective journeys on
Let's
that.
be honest, David, we all only have time for one or two social media platforms, if we're being honest. So awesome. Well, we'll obviously link to the book in the show notes and to your social media profiles. And congratulations again. This is, really an amazing, accessible entree into getting strong. So
I appreciate that. And thank you both for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for listening to the Ready State Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, check out all our episodes here or at thereadystate.com. And be sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes to help others find our show.
Check us out and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Ready State.
Until next time, cheers, everyone.
You got it. You better stop it.